Good afternoon, and welcome to the October installment of the American Antiquarian Society's virtual book talk series. We are coming to you from the ancestral homeland of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active and vibrant presence here in central Massachusetts. My name is John Garcia, the Society's Director of Scholarly Programs and Partnerships. Today's book talk features Caroline Wigginton and her recent monograph, Indigenuity, Native Craftwork and the Art of American Literatures, which is published in 2022 by the University of North Carolina Press. The virtual book talk series are sponsored by the AAS Program in the History of the Book and American Culture. And this series features recent monographs broadly related to book history, print culture, and material texts. And now I want to give a little background for those new to the American Antiquarian Society. We were founded in 1812 by the printer Isaiah Thomas in Worcester, Massachusetts, where we have remained ever since. Our goal is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in our ever-growing collection of primary sources, which currently number over 4.5 million items. We have the largest and most accessible collection of early American books, pamphlets, newspapers, manuscripts, and the graphic arts produced before 1900 in what is today the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. The Society fosters a broad community of inquiry through public programming and generous support for scholarship. We welcome researchers from around the world to use our collections, both in person and digitally. Please check out our website to find out more about us at www.americanantiquarian.org. I'm joined behind the scenes today by my colleague, Nan Wolverton. Throughout the program, Nan will post information into the chat to give you so you can learn more about today's program and also for instructions on how to use the Q&A function later in the program. We encourage audience members to share their questions, and this will be the basis for a lively conversation after our speaker has concluded her presentation. As a reminder to all, this program is being recorded, and it will be available soon on the AAS YouTube channel in the days to come. We thank you for supporting us, and as a reminder, we are a nonprofit organization, and we welcome any support that you can provide to advance our mission. And now, it's my pleasure to welcome today's speaker. Caroline Wigginton is Chair and Associate Professor at the University of Mississippi, where she has taught since 2013. She is the author of In the Neighborhood, Women's Publication in Early America, which won the Early American First Book Prize. She also co-edited Transnational Feminisms in the Age of Revolutions, which is published by Oxford University Press in 2012. More recently, Caroline co-edited an important form called Materials and Methods in Native American and Indigenous Studies, which was co-published with the William and Mary Quarterly and Early American Literature. Her articles have appeared in many venues, including Early American Literature, Native American Indigenous Studies, American Literature, and Legacy. Caroline is also a founder of the Andrew W. Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography at the Rare Book School. And I'm also happy to mention that Caroline was recently elected a member of the American Antiquarian Society earlier this month. And with that, I'm excited to turn over the program to today's speaker. Caroline, take it away.
Thank you so much, John. So lovely to see you. You are also a founding member of the Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography. It's also a delight to be participating and providing the American Antiquarian Society with a book talk. The American Antiquarian Society was one of the original archives and libraries that was supportive of my scholarship back when I was a graduate student. And I believe I can honestly say that I probably wouldn't have had the career that I've had without the encouragement and support of the wonderful librarians and staff and other people at the American Antiquarian Society. I also want to pause and acknowledge that today I'm joining you from the ancestral and spiritual homelands of the Chickasaw peoples, which is where I talk and live and research today. And so Yakoki to those people and to the near neighbors, the Choctaw Nation. My plan today is to begin by reading the first paragraph of the book, in which I try and lay out a very broad sense of the argument of the book. I actually do that over the first several paragraphs, but I'll just stick with the first paragraph to give a sense of that. And then after that, it is to simply go through the structure of the book, highlighting some of the, providing lots of images, things to look at, and give a sense of the objects and texts and other items that I structure the book around. So I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation to give that sense to you. So again, the book is Indigenuity, Native Craftwork and the Art of American Literatures. The focus of the book is right there in the title. It's about that relationship between Native craftwork and American literature. And one of the arguments of the book is that American literary history is inextricably and perpetually in orientation and in relationship with Native craftwork and its aesthetics. I lay that out in the introduction. And so again, I'll read the opening paragraph, which begins, "Here is a story of the interweavings of Native craftwork and American literatures from their ancient roots to the present. Focused primarily on North America, especially the colonized lands and waters now claimed by the United States, Indigenuity argues for the foundational but often hidden aesthetic orientation of American literary history to Native craftwork, or the functional and beautiful material objects made by Indigenous peoples for personal and collective use. For hundreds of years, until the late 19th century advent of pulped to binding print mechanization, American artisanship and American authorship were entangled practices rather than distinct disciplines. Objects, including books, were multi-sensory things all North American communities and cultures, including native and settler colonial ones, regularly made and used, frequently the productions of household and local economies. All cultures and communities narrated and documented their histories and imaginations through a variety of media, all created items for domestic, sacred, curative, and collective purposes. Moreover, the natural environments served simultaneously as imaginative and material fodder for expressive practices, as the same ingredients might give color to both ink and dye, the same botanical shape might inspire both pattern and poem. The making and using of craftwork and literature buttressed and adorned daily lives and seasonal rituals. Craftwork and literature were necessities rather than luxuries, so much so that the entire hemisphere was a tapestry of trade networks and artisanal exchanges well before the arrival of the first Europeans, who themselves came seeking new resources and goods and new habits of making and using, and who wrote new literatures in response to their experiences. So to tell this story, I begin with, in the introduction, I begin with two objects, and they are an Odawa basket that was collected around 1820 or 1830s in what is now Michilimackinac or Fort Mackinac. And as you can see, it's cataloged. It's at the I don't think I'd say where it's located, but it's at the Smithsonian. It's actually one of the founding items that's collected that becomes part of the Smithsonian Museum. And here you'll see that it looks like a vase. It's actually really small, and it is, I don't have an image of it, but it's made from birch bark, and it's got this basswood thread around the sides and has this quill work and this botanical decorations. And underneath is the printed pages of a French language book. So it is this combination of very customary Odawa basketry, but put together in a way that is a commodity for sale at Fort Mackinac, which is a trading center, long been a trading center since well before the arrival of Europeans, and at the same time is also incorporates European and Euro-American codex and print technologies. So there's paper on the bottom, like I said, that's structuring the bottom, and there's also paper lining the inside. So the introduction begins by thinking about how this is an object of a craft object, but also how it's a work of literature, or can be read as a work of Odawa literature, and juxtaposes that with Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, the Ojibwe author from roughly the same period, who is also writing poetry and participating in a community of making texts, making stories, making narratives, making poems, and thinking about the ways that this too is both a object of native craft. This poem that you see on the side, I give you the long version, so it's probably not, the words themselves may not be legible, but thinking about the sort of stitching that is happening, the sort of layering that's happening, that in many ways evokes the lines of quill work itself, and contains emotion and grief, both in terms of the poem itself and in terms of the magazine, the manuscript magazine that it's part of, that is constructed through relationships that include those with her husband and her relatives as well. So thinking about the confluences between both of these items and the ways that they are oriented to each other and oriented to the place and the makers and the families, but also oriented to particular archives that then go on to collect them and use them to support particular kinds of stories about settler colonial conquest and ingenuity, and thinking about how they also continue to tell these stories about the places where they come from, the communities where they come from, and the collections and archives and stories of those Indigenous people as well. So that's where I begin with the introduction, and use those objects to think about laying out a core argument and a core approach that I will then follow through a variety of other 5 chapters and then a coda. In the first chapter, I think even more so about orientation. This particular this slide, and I do that with today with each of the chapter slides. I break down the different sections that I talk about in each chapter. So here in chapter 1, it's about orientation. So one of the arguments of the book is that American literatures and there's libraries and special collections, their narratives, their materiality is always has been, and continues to be and will be in orientation to Indigenous aesthetics, Indigenous lands, Indigenous practices, even when those orientations are subsumed or unwitting or hidden, that remains as a fundamental aspect of American literature. So orientation builds upon that component of the argument by examining the travel narrative of a particular Euro-American author, Jonathan Carver, who writes publishes a book about his search for the Northwest Passage in the 1760s. So the first part of that chapter begins by talking about the very long history, over 1,000-year history of Indigenous peoples building earthworks, creating other monumental forms of craft in the upper Mississippi River Valley in order to orient themselves, orient their communities, orient their rituals and their craft practices to where they are, to their lands, and how this is an ongoing practice of orientation. So an earthwork helps orient a community and both in a long standpoint, but also in terms of being a place to continue to come and conduct rituals, helps orient to the the ordinal directions, north, south, east, west, but also to vertically to the above world and also the beneath world. So thinking about this ongoing crafted cartographic space and cartographic craftwork that's been part of this region for, by the time Carver gets there, about 1,000 years. And so Carver, when he shows up as this not particularly deft, but still determined, and surveyor who's going to come with the help of various guides to come through this place and find the Northwest Passage in the 1760s. So he's coming through after the 7 Years' War. He's a veteran of that. He's coming through and he's keeping track of his orientations through a surveyor's log. He's writing a journal about his experience, and he's drawing pictures, including maps about his experiences as well. So the beginning of the chapter, like I said, looks at and thinks about these big earthworks and effigies. So this is an example of increased Lapham in 1855, goes through Wisconsin, and he does this big book where he maps and draws all of the earthworks that he can find in Wisconsin. I tried to give you a whole sense of the map, but there's lots and lots. There's like a few hundred of them at least on this map of Wisconsin, and a lot of them are along the routes that Carver takes. And then he also gives detailed drawings of particular sites where he's gone. So this is an example here of a Ho-Chunk or Winnebago site that is at a location where Jonathan Carver comes through. So he's going through this space, and this entire landscape that he's in has been partnered with by Indigenous peoples to produce this kind of map. So Carver's coming through the space, thinking about these orientations, mapping his experiences, but he's also encountering stories that talk about the kinds of relationships and orientations that one has. And this is inviting him to put himself into orientation. Sometimes the orientations that he is creating through his craft work are ones of humility, of uncertainty, but oftentimes they're settler colonial ones as well, of attempts to master or know or become the centerpiece of a particular kind of cartography or understanding of space. So thinking about the relationship between his Euro-American and settler colonial cartography and map making, and the purposes and practices of that that is occurring within the space of Indigenous cartography. So this is an example here, for example, of him encountering, so he encounters stories of the beneath world spirit. He encounters them in a cave that's now called Carver's Cave, which is in St. Paul, Minnesota. And he sees all kinds of petroglyphs and other markings on the wall inside the cave, and you hear stories about these beneath world spirits and how this is a place of really important Dakota sacred origins and birth, but also that there is powerful spirits in this place as well. And he also hears stories about other kinds of similar kinds of creatures elsewhere in the landscape. And so this is an example at the top by a Meskwaki storyteller, Andrew Kiana, to give us a sense of the kinds of drawings and the longevity of this kind of drawing, which I believe connects to this longer cartographic practice. And then below, we see an example of Carver's version or rendering of the kinds of an image that replicates the kind of stories that he's hearing. So we see him entering into aesthetic and craft relationship with these. It's also shaping how he understands communication. So this is an example of him mapping out how conversation happens as his guides are moving through the landscape and communicating with each other, especially if they are moving through each other's the guides are taking him from their own territory through another kind of territory. So this is an example for him of how his Dakota guides would communicate with Anishinaabe peoples that they are coming through Anishinaabe territories peacefully. And so this is, so he maps out how that happens. So again, this is a kind of him becoming, understanding, learning about these practices of shaping, mapping, locating, orienting in space, sometimes monumentally, sometimes on rock, sometimes with rock, sometimes on tree, sometimes with story, and himself being participating and being shaped by that back. I also look at some of the maps that he creates. So this is an example of a hand-drawn map. It's at the British Library, and you'll see how there's a kind of a serpentine feel to this map, that there's ways that this kind of aesthetic is infiltrating and influencing and present in the map making that he does. And again, it's very small, but he also has little moments on the map in his handwriting that point to some of the stories that he's heard and told about. So we see that integration. So that way his Euro-American and settler colonial map making is in orientation to this longer history of Indigenous map making, Indigenous cartography, and it is present and shaping this text, which would not seem to be shaped by Indigenous aesthetics, but at the same time, that's one of my arguments. In chapter 2, I'm looking specifically at I call it perception, and I'm interested in the woman who's known today in the Catholic Church as Saint Kateri. She was a 17th century Kanengahaka Mohawk woman who converted to Catholicism and migrated from where she lived in what's now kind of near Albany, New York, up to Ganawage, which is a Kanengahaka Mohawk reserve or community, primarily Kanengahaka Mohawk, but also some other Indigenous peoples from the regions. There's also a Catholic Jesuit mission there, and she relocates and migrates to Ganawage and to take up the kind of devotional and ascetic life that she's interested in. Part of what the Jesuits talk about a lot in much of what we know about Kateri comes from Jesuit hagiographies and reports about their mission there. So it's filtered through and interpreted through Jesuit writing. And one of the things I often insist upon is how exceptional she is, not just in terms of being exceptionally pious, but also the ways that she is, to them, resembles a French girl in the body of a Kanengahaka Mohawk woman. But they also reveal and mention multiple times how much she knows about craftwork and how much she's trained and taught and has learned about craftwork and how deft she is. They talk about her very delicate work. So I'm interested in that chapter about the ways that she has learned and been educated by women in the Longhouse to do this kind of work, which really emphasizes a kind of deft skill and imagination that so there's this display that's happening through the design of Craftwork, but the sort of effort and the structural underpinnings, the more well done it is, the less you will see evidence of the work itself, right? The less you will see the knots underneath, the less you will see the ends folding over each other. So there's this combination of display and concealment that is the height of skill, and the more that happens, the more one communicates one's deftness. So in that chapter, I'm thinking about how Kateri is moving onto Ganawage and taking up a different kind of craft work. And this craft work, she continues to make craft objects more often to adorn the mission church, the chapel there, but she's also engaging in bodily mortification. So she's continuing to use the same resources, material resources, but now what she's doing is she's marking her body instead of designing the surface of craft work. So thinking about different kinds of ways that one displays and hides and communicates and creates craft and an ornament in order to communicate skill, to communicate spiritual status, to communicate one's relationships with other people. So thinking about the interrelation of those things. And then in that chapter, I'm also thinking about the ways that those images, those ideas of her circulate, not just within the community of Ganawage, but circulate after her death when people begin to talk about her as somebody who produces miracles. So here, for example, are a couple of images of her. These are pretty early. The one on the left, which is from Lettre Édifiante, this one is from 1770. There's one from 1712, I believe, as well. This is the same picture. Then we see that in 1724, La Gracia Triunfante, which is being published down in Mexico City, and which is a Spanish language, very small Spanish language text that is arguing about why Indigenous women in New Spain should be included in convent life, is using or talks about the story, the narrative of Kateri as an argument for, as an example of how that's happening in Ganawage. So again, we see that this image of her has been ported and reshaped for, you can, I think if you look in, you can see how in many ways it's very similar to the Parisian one, but is also a little bit different. So how it's been relocated and repurposed. There's also very interestingly other things that are happening at the level of skin. So in Kateri's story, when she dies, she had, well, prior to her death, she had smallpox. She'd had smallpox as a little girl. And one of the things that's well known about her is that she is, her body is very scarred. It's scarred from her mortifications. It's scarred from her disease. But when she dies, her skin is, so the story goes, her skin clears and it becomes white, and so she's called the Lily of the Mohawks, is the nickname that she's given. And at this moment of her death, she gets this mark of God's grace, and the order of sanctitude emanates from her. But in the pictures, like sometimes she's depicted as having the scarred skin, and sometimes she's not. So the chapter thinks about where these texts are, where these images are, who is looking at them, and why it's important. And some of them that her skin is scarred, and some of them that it is not. I also think it's interesting that the image in the middle, the one from La Gracia Triunfante, it looks to me like that cross that she's holding has been touched over and over again. So thinking about images of her also as devotional objects. The most famous image of her, though, is one that was supposedly painted by Claude Chauchetier, who is a Jesuit priest at Ganawage who knows her and starts to have visions of her, and he starts making portraits. These are part of the miracle cures. You can see how it looks. I'll flip back up. It looks very different than this other one, right? Instead of being earthbound and with her scarred skin, and really kind of like she just seems like she's right there in front of you. Here she is, her skin is unmarked. She's turned the other way. She almost seems to be floating. And so there's a kind of transcendence to this picture, even as she's wearing objects of adornment. So I'm also interested in that chapter of thinking about all the different, like I said, all the different places these images go, where they're being published, what languages they're being published, and the ways this image and these various images broadly circulate about her. And then finally, I'm interested in the ways that Indigenous women artists continue to think through and talk about and reinterpret her story, her surfaces, concealment, display, aesthetics, and different kinds of modalities. So here are examples of two contemporary Indigenous women artists who are continuing that work. So I won't go into too much detail, happy to do that during Q&A, but here are two example objects, one that looks kind of like a movie poster, and to me, one of the fascinating things about that one is how the whiteness seems to be dripping down, but it also seems like the redness is coming up. So this sort of, which I think is really apropos for the kind of constant dynamism and relationship that American literatures and Native craftwork have with each other through this long history. And then the other one is a basket made by originally Mary Gawina Dagi Adams was originally a Ganawage, and then she moved the Aguasasne Mohawk Reserve, and she just makes. She's considered one of the she's since passed away, but just a master basket maker. And this one is I'm not sure if you can see it, but right around the rim, as well, it's made from sweetgrass, but she has lots of little other baskets adorning the lip of it. So just thinking about this continual integration of stories and containers and baskets and decoration and display that's bringing together these multiple histories. In chapter 3, I'm thinking about ideas of color and the relationship between color and place, and how settler colonists and Indigenous peoples translate color and understand color. So this is so that's the focus of chapter 3. Specifically, again, related to the Southeast. So this is a chapter that's very much related to where I live, as I mentioned at the beginning, in Chickasaw lands. So this particular chapter begins by looking at settler colonists, sometimes French, sometimes British, and the ways that they are seeking to understand the color of this new place that they're in, thinking about how do they describe the color, how do they translate color, how do they depict color, how do they note when and explain how Indigenous peoples make color, because of course people are making inks, making dyes. This is one of the key aspects of settler colonialism and colonialism in general, the resource extractive one that's less worried about the settler side than it is about the resource extraction and colonization side, is identifying pigments and dyes and ingredients for color. So of course, Brazil is named for pau de Brazil, the Brazil wood, right? One of the most essential, for a while until it gets over harvested, one of the key red dyes of the early settler colonial period and the early modern period. So so the search for color is essential to settler colonialism. So thinking about how they're finding that knowledge, using it, understanding the landscape through color, and depicting, representing how people belong to place or don't belong to place, know place or don't know place, through their use of color, their craft of color. From there, I'm also thinking about, so that's more of a, like, how are people thinking about color as the materiality of color? But then I'm also, so that's a depictive, I call it, translation. But I'm also thinking about the linguistic translation of color. So there is, for example, in the Choctaw language, and Chickasaw, which are very similar languages, blue and green are a little difficult for French and English colonists to translate, because whereas in English and French there is blue and green, in Choctaw and Chickasaw it's not that same divide. So in that, I'm interested in all these different ways that people translate color. So for example, here we have a vocabulary by Cyrus Byington, who is listing all of the colors between English and Choctaw. This is like a vocabulary to be used in mission schools and in the Choctaw, for removed Choctaws in Oklahoma. But if you look at it, first of all, if we look at blue and green, we see that there's a deep blue and a pale blue. So Okchimali is deep blue here. Okchako is pale blue. And if you go down further, you'll see that gray and green is also Okchimali. So the same word for deep blue is also the same word for gray and green. So we see that there's all of this difference from English and French, and this struggle to do that translation. Excuse me. But also, if you look at this list, some of these don't seem to be colors. Some of them actually seem to be horse coats. So thinking about there, just the ways that, how does one learn about color? How does one know what the terms are? And it's often through situations and stories. So thinking about the stories that underpin our understandings of color. So I speculate about like when would have Cyrus Byington learn these colors, what kind of situation, what kind of moment, and how does it work through that process? And just to highlight the relationship between very vivid color and also Choctaw peoples, here's an example from George Catlin's ball players, and the man on the far left is a ball player, and he is obviously he's wearing horsehair that's dyed in a lot of different ways in order to, so one can imagine a stickball game where people are talking about horses and also talking about color. To further highlight the sort of constant fluctuations or confusions and uncertainties and relationships that are happening through ideas about colors and the process of trying to know the Indigenous Southeast through color. I also provide a whole list of all of the examples I found of settler colonists in manuscript or books or whatever, or printed books, I should say, of trying to pin down what they think about Okchako and Okchimali, the two words that could in theory be blue and green, but don't seem to align neatly. So you'll see here that they're a little all over the place, but also how Choctaw Nation itself has tried to take control of or manage that alignment as well. And then that particular chapter ends with a discussion of color in contemporary Indigenous art. So this is an example, one of the examples I talk about from Jeffrey Gibson, who is a Choctaw Band of Mississippi, a citizen of that nation. So he's a multimedia artist who is just so much color in his artistry. And this is an image of a recent exhibition he put on at the Brooklyn Museum. And here you can see all of the bringing together of craft, of text, of color, and the ways that it is continuing to orient not just settler colonial ideas about indigeneity, but also the ways that settler colonial artists and writers and authors are continuing to tell their stories and understand their role and place through the use of color. Chapter 4 is interested in music making or composition. So I looked at an example of 3 different men from the native Northeast who make books. I'm just going to try and go relatively quickly. I'm going to try and be done in the next 5 to 10 minutes. So my apologies in advance for speeding up here. Here is an example of the kinds of music books that people are encountering, both settler colonists, Indigenous peoples, Black persons, all of the different people in the Northeast and an Indigenous Northeast, and the roles that these books are used to understand how to sing together, and the role of books in bringing the community together and bringing bodies together. But thinking about how sound and music especially is also part of diplomacy, Indigenous diplomacy in the Northeast. So for example, here we see a variety of objects, including wampum, which isn't just, it's a material object, of course, but it is also a sounded object, that when people are remembering the story, they're often would sing the story or dance the story of a particular treaty conversation or diplomatic conversation. Excuse me. So we're looking at wampum. I think about the ways that the lines of the wampum belt evoke the lines of the staff, and why this would produce a sense of interest and investment, perhaps, in Indigenous community members who, when they encounter music books, the sense that these are objects that are parallel to material objects that are used for community making, for fellowship, for diplomacy, for binding people together, both over long periods of time, but also in the moment, through the moment of performance. So these are some examples, like I said, of music books. These are examples of various kinds of made objects. The bottom two are related to Mohegan, and in particular, I'm interested in this chapter about Joseph Johnson, who is a Mohegan man around 1770, and he is making music books for the Farmington Indians when he's a school teacher there. And while we don't have his books, we do have a sense of what he's doing, and he says he's pricking them and stitching them and sewing them. So we get a sense of that kind of materiality to the book, and his determination to make these music books for his community. And just to reiterate the sort of parallels between the different kinds of practices, here I have a picture of Haudenosaunee chiefs reading a wampum belt together, and also a group of men sitting around singing together. So we have that parallel there. The chapter also looks at about 50 or 60 years later, Thomas Kamuk, who is another man associated with the same Northeastern Indigenous communities, but by now he's migrated with other members of those communities over to Brothertown, which is first in upstate, what's now upstate New York, near Oneida, or it's actually in Oneida, or what was Oneida. They negotiate for some land from Oneida, and then now is in what's called Wisconsin, in lands that they negotiated with the Menominee for. So here, Thomas Kamuk is making another book that resembles what I imagine Joseph Johnson's might have looked like, but his is a printed book. But his, very interestingly, follows a different model of song naming. Euro-American and English music books often name songs after English and settler colonial towns, but he's named them for Indigenous peoples and leaders. And he's also replicated a lot of models. He's ported over lyrics from other hymns, but he has given them these new names and arranged them according to different kinds of melodies. So thinking about the different ways that he is enacting through the making of a music book, understandings of Indigenous community. And then finally in that chapter, I look at a contemporary composer, Brent Michael Davids, who is Mohican, which is a very, follows a similar trajectory to Brothertown, and their Stockbridge Mohican and Brothertown are near each other today. I'm thinking about in he's a composer, I'm thinking about the ways that he brings visuality and story and place into his contemporary compositions as well. The last chapter looks at the work of Angel Decora, who is a Ho-Chunk teacher and artist and book artist as well. I'm thinking about her understanding of the role of Indigenous craftwork in print design and print ornamentation. So with that chapter, I think about the ways that she has been reared and brought up to a sense of Ho-Chunk design and aesthetics. And then after that, she goes to boarding school in Hampton. She's taken without her family's permission to Hampton, where she becomes a student. And that's where she receives a boarding school education in a whole bunch of things that are often taught to Black and Native youth at the boarding schools, but also begins to explore settler colonial ideas of art and design. And so she brings these things together, these understandings of art and design, into a career that does a lot of book illustration and book design. Let's see if the next slide will come up. Oh, it went too fast. So here are examples of some chapter title designs that she does for a book called The Indians Book. She does the Lake Indians Winnebago one first. So this, of course, is related to her community. You can see a lot of similarities between that sash that she has over the title page and the sash I put up a moment ago. But she does a completely different design and different style of lettering, of artistry, aesthetics all based in other Indigenous communities, aesthetics and Indigenous craft work for the other title pages. And these are just a sampling of them. They're stunning and gorgeous and interesting. So thinking about the ways that she understands the importance of knowing and adapting from an artist standpoint a community's approach to art, a community's approach to design, but bringing that to new media and new technologies. And how then, as a teacher at Carlisle Indian Boarding School, she's the art teacher there, and she also works with students who are designing print ornamentation, how she also starts to bring that skill across her career. So here's an example of a decorated initial that she has both designed for another book and then later appears in the print at Carlisle. So it doesn't say either one is by Decora, but she is the common factor in these two otherwise very disparate publications from completely different times and places. Here's an example of on the one hand, on the right, rug design that she has encouraged students to do, and that she is selling through this catalog that would have been printed by Carlisle students. And then on the left, an eye that she is has on there as well, that she's designed with them. Sorry about that. I just turned off my phone. My office phone. Let's hope that works. The next one is an example of to highlight the ways that she's turning to anthropological and ethnographic text in order to teach her students to think about design. So the item on the left is from Alfred Kroeber's The Arapaho, which is one of those ethnographic anthropological society reports that are very common in this time period. And the one on the right is the initial design by Carlisle students. You can see that it's almost the exact same letter design for it. So you can see how the students and she are turning to anthropological texts in order to repatriate ideas about design, ideas about art, ideas about aesthetics to circa 1900 Indigenous print. So I'm interested in that book, and I look at a longer history of Indigenous bookmaking at the end of that chapter. So here is Ella Deloria, who's a Dakota author, working with Mary Sully, who's also Dakota, on print design. And then here's in Ho-Chunk and Meskwaki author Dwayne Slick, who's created who's a book artist. So this is an example of a work of book art that he did, where he's again interested in ideas about craft work and about design as well. And that's where I take it. The conclusion is about very contemporary weavings, very contemporary book art, in order to circle back to the introduction. So the cover image, the book cover image, also comes from this piece by Sarah Sense, who's Choctaw Chinimaka and Euro-American, and thinking about the ways that settler colonial materials and these Indigenous craftwork practices continue to be woven together and continue to orient each other. So I use that example to highlight that. I'm going to leave it there because I would love to do some Q&A. I'm also going to grab some water very quickly. And so I will briefly mute and turn off my screen while listening to John begin to ask questions. Let me stop sharing. Here we go. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Caroline. We have plenty of time for Q&A. Just as we get started for this portion of the program, I just want to remind everyone in the audience that you should definitely post questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. So that way we can see them. And of course, we'll try to get through as many as we can today. This is such a fantastic book. And while Caroline is catching her breath, one thing I want to point out is that you've used this term color many times, and I just want to emphasize for people as a plug for the book that all of the images that Caroline has shown are reproduced in very high quality color. It's actually kind of unusual, I think, for especially for a book of, which is partially a book of literary history, right? We often don't get this degree of color reproduction. So that's just a plug. It's something definitely well worth looking into. So Caroline, as the questions kind of come in, we do have one very specific, but about beadwork. But before that, I just wanted to ask a question, kind of going back, thinking about the overall range of materials that you're looking at. And there's a lot, right? It's an ambitious book. There's really no time to kind of go through all of them. I mean, you've given us a wonderful survey, but in terms of how your work intersects with the history of the book, right? There's lots of ways of going into your project, but I'm noticing as I was reading the kind of range of materials, right? We have an 18th century map from Jonathan Carver. We have the Kateri engravings. And we even have, towards the last section, a wonderful chapter about a book design from Angel Decora. So I'm just curious if you could say a little bit about how your approach coming from Native American and Indigenous studies helps us to maybe revise ideas about book history, or just give us new ways to work with materials, or even just to American literature in general, which is also part of the book's argument.
Well, I'm trained originally was trained as an early Americanist, and then became interested in ideas, more material ideas about publication and book history by taking a class with the now esteemed emeritus professor Michael Winship, who was just a fascinating person to take a class with, and coming to the American Antiquarian Society and encountering for the first time outside of that classroom experience archives and special collections and manuscripts and all of that, and just seeing what happens when you the difference between encountering images of things, photocopies, modern prints, editions, or even just digital versions of older objects to actually touch and see and feel things. And so in some ways it began with that, just the experience of being in archives and special collections and thinking about the differences with that, which then made me wonder how, as I embarked on a second book, made me wonder about the touching, holding, and making of books in early America when perhaps the materials were different. And that's really where the project began. And it really obviously spun out from there, because in a lot of cases, I found that the materials actually, at least for the sort of traditional print codex in first, in colonies and then in the US, wasn't all that different. People were, settler colonists were often using similar ink in the print shop. They were still loved a good goat binding. They weren't like, I searched high and low for deerskin bindings, and I found a few, but not frequent ones. Most of the time it was the same things. And so that made me wonder about not so much the explicit materials themselves, but the practices of making, and just that, how were those shaping each other? So I really had to activate a lot of different methodologies and ways of thinking, and ways that Native American and Indigenous studies helped with that is, first of all, the range of scholars and theories that I was reading took me outside of maybe where I had been originally trained in terms of early American literary history and 18th century British studies and those sorts of things. And even sort of the historiography and other kinds of texts. So first of all, just new kinds of theories of what are books, where are books, what are humans, what are relationships like. So just really pushing me outside of those understandings, but also spending time talking to contemporary artists, Indigenous artists themselves, and hearing from them the kinds of questions and ways of looking that they were bringing. So for me, the ways that Native American and Indigenous studies shaped the project, in addition from the kinds of archives and objects I was looking at, was in terms of the scholarship and the methods that those were providing, and in terms of the artists that I was speaking to, who provided just different ways of and different questions for me to ask, and different perspectives on the kinds of objects and items and books that I was looking at.
Great, great. That's fantastic. Thank you. And your answer, I think, kind of blends into one of the questions. Katie Childs says, such a great book and great presentation. And I think in some ways you kind of addressed this question that she asked here about how do you manage working across several disciplines, right? Not just literary studies, not just book history, but Native American and Indigenous studies, and also art history. Did you want to add a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think it's been really exciting, but also really humbling to work across a lot of disciplines. I've definitely found that sometimes a question that was new to me is an old question in another discipline. So I might show, like, sometimes I would ask questions or want to do something and realize there were lots of people had actually already asked that question. They decided I just wasn't aware of it because it was art historians and I hadn't read a ton of art history. So that was a sort of reminder, and I think that's one of the delights of doing interdisciplinary work is learning about a wider range of really fascinating and important work that's happening outside of one's own discipline, whether it's about the same time period or the same objects or communities or contexts, but just really that process of curiosity and learning that happens, but also like I said, those moments of humility where you come and think, this is the greatest question anybody's ever asked. Why hasn't anybody asked this? And then it turns out, yes, somebody has actually asked that and worked on it. So I find that so I mostly just try and read and listen a lot and think about what is it that I can learn from all of these different smart and brilliant disciplines and people. But I also think that when doing Native American and Indigenous studies, those and writing about it in an ethical and responsible way about Native American and Indigenous communities and peoples, whether historical or contemporary, those voices have to be at the center. They have to be at the center from a secondary scholarly standpoint and also from a primary material standpoint. Because, for example, the chapter on music books, where I'm talking, where the central person or one of the people is Thomas Kamuk, who is a Narragansett man who's also a member of the Brothertown community. I had spoken with Courtney Cottrell, who is a Brothertown scholar and academic, but also a member of their cultural preservation and knowledge community there. And one of the things she did is said, could you please change every spelling of Brothertown to Brothertown with a W, not Brotherton without the W, because we are in part of ongoing federal recognition cases insisting upon the long history of our community, and having a consistent spelling of that word helps our case when it's in scholarship. And to me, I was sort of going with Samson Occam spelled it without the W, so I will spell it like Samson Occam, and that's the real legitimate spelling because my early Americanist self is like, that's, follow that. But no, spelling it with the W is really important to contemporary Brothertown people. And so remembering that and highlighting and centering Indigenous voices and needs, not in a way that's like, against the truth of the scholarship, but that recognizes that our scholarship can and should have material, hopefully material impacts in the world, and keeping that in mind.
Great. More questions are coming in. I see one comment here that actually is quite interesting. This is from Rob Nure, who says, it's worth noting that the research for increased Lapham's Antiquities of Wisconsin was partially funded by, or was funded by the American Antiquarian Society. You can comment on that if you wish, but I mean, one thing to point out is that a month ago we did a program with Kristen Mucher and her book on Before American History, which also kind of explored those ideas as well. We have a number of questions. Did you want to respond to that, or we can go on to one or two others?
I had actually entirely forgotten that until then. I was about to say I didn't know that, and then my brain was said, "Yes, you did," but it was a long time ago. I never had a chance. I think we all have our COVID stories, but one of my COVID stories is being having a sabbatical and fellowship time and research time set aside at the end of the book process, and then there we all were. So I never got a chance to come back to the American Antiquarian Society as I'd hoped to. So I never had a chance to spend time with Increase Lapham's manuscripts and maps, but I would love to sometime. They must be utterly fascinating.
Come back anytime. Gordon Fraser, one of our current fellows, says, "Thank you for your fascinating talk." And he was curious to know more about Decora's images making their way into print.
Okay.
I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about how the images made it into various book forms. And this was, I believe, the last chapter you talked about in the book. Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah. So Angel Decora, after she graduates from Hampton Institute, instead of returning to Ho Chunk, which many graduates would return to their communities, she actually went on to art school. She went to learn art at Smith College, which is where Kristen Mucher is, that John just mentioned. She went to Drexel Institute in Philadelphia. She trained as a book illustrator with Howard Pyle, who is like the guy who I don't know. I remember images of like the Robin Hood book from around the late 1800s. Is images of Robin Hood. He trains N.C. Wyeth, who does Treasure Island. So he has a whole school of book illustration that Angel Decora is at. So Angel Decora is a quote unquote trained book illustrator who tries to have a career as a working artist. She does illustrations for and book covers and print ornamentation for Zitkallah Shaw's Old Indian Legends. She does a really famous frontispiece for Francis LaFlèche's The Middle Five. She does works for other books that have had maybe less staying power in literary history, and then it's life of a working artist has long been a difficult one, and she decides to accept a job as the art teacher at Carlisle. And so, first of all, her earliest images get into print because she is working in the publishing industry. She is, and sometimes her paintings are being reproduced, and of course, she's also, as a working artist, often doing studies and drawings and paintings, and that's part of what's happening. At Carlisle, she's helping the students with design of print ornamentation and other kinds of artwork as well. They make craft objects, then they print catalogs about the craft objects. Because this is part of what the boarding school does, is it's training Indigenous youth in order to have these kinds of jobs, including printers and craft makers. So they're designing letters, but a lot of the letters that the newspapers and magazines that are coming out of Carlisle are printed have actually already appeared in books that Decora has worked on. So even though it never says this is a Decora design, it seems pretty clear that Decora is participating in these. That the students didn't come up with that if So that gets some of her stuff, but of course, other things they're designing. And then the boarding schools are pretty integrated with each other. They all subscribe to each other's newspapers and magazines, and they share printer stuff with each other. So they send stock about, and they replicate and use each other's prints. So I talk about some of that in the chapter 2. Is about the ways that there circulates that Carlisle ideas about aesthetics and print ornamentation are coming out of Carlisle and going to other boarding schools and appearing in, there's a really wide, there's a vast Indigenous Indian boarding school print network and print shops, and they're all using each other's, but especially using Carlisle's print design.
You mentioned aesthetics, and aesthetics is a term that comes up throughout the book in really interesting ways. There's a question here that maybe we can end with. There's many questions, and unfortunately we don't have time to get to them, but that's always a sign of a rich presentation. Maybe we can end here with Marie Taylor. She says, there's so much, thanks so much, Caroline. She wants to know a little bit about relationality and kinship. Is there a sense that these objects themselves create relationships? And are they created within relationships, and do they create relationships? Do you want to say a little bit more about that as our last question?
I could give the short answer, which is yes. Yes, absolutely. I think that if I go back where I began with Carver in chapter 1, Carver is he's a surveyor and map maker, and he is his job is to know from a cartographic standpoint, a settler colonial cartographic standpoint, this space, that he, as a representative of at that point the British Empire, wants to know, wants to master. And of course, there's lots of scholarship about like the shift of perspectives in European map making at this time, and the ways that it's the Cartesian system and the representations of space, and the flattening, and like these are not the only ways one could understand space or do maps, but how this is a part of the early modern period. And so he's in this space, but he's coming in to master. But at the same time, he's in the space itself. He's in the space of this craft work. He's in the space of these earthworks. He's with these people who are telling him stories, who are his guides, who are choosing what to share with him, choosing what not to share with him, that have all of this, not just monumental craft work of earthworks and petroglyphs like making designs with boulders and earthworks. All of this stuff is there, but also pottery and baskets and all this more ephemeral craft work that also replicates these kinds of ideas about orientation and relationality, relation to place, relation to the powers that structure that place, whether that is human powers or more than human powers. And so he thinks he's coming there to master, and it's not like he's never like, surprise, settler colonialism is wrong. It's not like he does that, right? But he is entering in relationship and shaped by those relationships. And as his texts return eastward, as they return to London, he is also extending and continuing those relationships as well. So I think it's all about relationality. That's not the same thing as kinship, of course, but I think it's all about relationality. I think there's other places where there's about kinship, like Thomas Comoke's Indian Melodies, and naming these songs about Indigenous places is about producing a sense of kinship and relationships between Indigenous communities in circa 1845. I'll leave it there. I could probably give lots more examples, but I think we're at the end, so.
I guess the answer also would be read the rest of the book.
Yes, that's probably the answer my publisher would say to give.
This is fantastic. Thank you so much, Caroline. This is going to conclude today's program, but before we end, I just want to advertise a few more events that are coming up. We have 3 lectures remaining for 2023. And I invite you to look at the website to learn more about the programs and also to register for these talks as well. On November 14th, we will have historian David Wallstreicher, who will be on a virtual program about his new book, The Odyssey of Phyllis Wheatley. That's on November 15th. Then on November 30th, we will have our final virtual book talk of the year, and that will be with author Michael Roy on his book, Fugitive Texts, Antebellum Slave Narratives and Print Culture. And last but not least, we'll also have on December 7th, this is a hybrid program with collector and author Ken Brendel speaking about a recent book called Safeguarding History. And as I mentioned, you can go to the website to learn more and to register for those. In the meantime, thank you so much. We'll see you next time. And once again, thank you, Caroline, for a fascinating talk.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.